Welcome to Books at Berklee. This is part of our series of books of the Berklee Library at the Berklee College of Music in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm Judy Pinnolis, your host, and today I have with me Mark Polanzak, who is one of the professors that teaches writing and literature at the Berklee College of Music. Mark is the author of the hybrid work Pop, the story collection, and the OK End of Funnytown, which won the BOA Short Fiction Prize. His fiction has appeared in Best American Non-Required Reading, the Southern Review, the American Scholar, and elsewhere. A founding editor for Draft, the Journal of Process. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for doing a Books at Berklee interview with me today. I'm very appreciative of that.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this. Thank you, Judy. It's good to be at Books at Berklee.
Thanks. Well, I have a few questions for you. First of all, I wanted to ask you to tell our audience a little bit about how the book came about.
The OK End of Funnytown?
The OK End of Funnytown is the book that we're going to be talking about today.
Okay. The OK End of Funnytown is a collection of short stories. So my first book is a memoir, that's Pop. The OK End of Funnytown is a collection of stories. So my first love in writing and in literature has been the short story. I was first drawn to it in high school when I took just a short story class and found out that you could experience all of these writers in the short form. And there was a way to get to know a writer. There was a way to have an experience in this short story when mostly all we studied were like novels and things.
Yeah.
We were looking at dramas and novels or poetry in short form. But then I discovered like, oh my God, there's like short fiction. And all of the great writers have like done short fiction. So I fell in love with it, reading it. And then it turns out to be the dominant form of fiction workshops. So if you wind up taking creative writing classes and you're working in fiction, you're not necessarily writing novels, so that's possible. You're writing short work so that you can actually get through a draft and then work on it and improve and write another one and keep on learning and improving and working on your writing. So the short story turns out to be something I love and also turns out to be the thing that you use most to practice with in a fiction workshop. They're also the things that magazines publish. So popular magazines like the New Yorker always have a short story in them. And then there's this whole world of literary magazines and journals that will publish short fiction. When I went off to graduate school, I got an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of Arizona. I took fiction workshop after fiction workshop. That was my concentration, was fiction. So I was churning out stories and learning from this and reading my peers' stories and becoming a better editor that way too. So this actual title story is a story that I wrote while in grad school, The OK End of Funnytown. And some of the other stories are from that time, but I have continued to write short stories after graduate school. I love to do it. I still do it to this day. And I send them out to magazines and then they get published and then sometimes anthologized. So it's the form I work in most. It is something that you can actually do in less time than a year. I'm working on a novel right now. It's been going on for 3 years. So it's nice to actually have a short story that you can complete and then work on and then send out into the world and have it be published. And then when you have enough of them, like I had like 18 published stories, I started to sort through and see if there was any thematic links between them, if it made sense to pull them all together for a collection, and found a way to arrange them thematically. And then once that happened, I sent it out to publishers and contests, and it won the BOA Short Fiction Prize in 2018, and then was published in 2020, right at the start of the pandemic. So all of the reading events and everything was all canceled, but I started to do virtual events and things like that. And then, I mean, it got reviews, it got nice critical reviews in the Globe and big places like Kirkus and Booklist, and that was gratifying and that was nice. And now the thing's out in the world and you've read it now.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed reading it a lot. You mentioned that these many of these were previously published, and we see that in the acknowledgments. You also have, where they were published, which is really nice, and that there was a thematic content to that. How did you decide, like, which one of all your stories that have been published to include, and the order? Does that give us any sense of importance in the book itself?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I really enjoyed arranging this collection. I mean, sometimes it seems like, oh, I've got a bunch of stories. They were all written individually. There's maybe something that combines them. And I've had, like people in the industry have said like, oh, a good way to structure a short story collection is to have short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, just like so that you give some like literally like variation in length of story to an editor or to a reader, so that like they're not reading the longest things all at the beginning. And then the other thing is people always say like, whatever your strongest piece is, put that first. Your strongest work, the thing that you think is best, put it first. Like you don't want to bury that. If someone has one chance, they open up the book, whether it's an editor or a potential reader of your work, you want to hit them with the thing that you think is best and keep them going. What you like most is not going to be what everybody else likes most, but it's a good strong way to put your best foot forward. And then also they say like put your second favorite or second best work last, so that when they're done with it, they're left with like, oh my God, that was great. And then your stories that aren't that great, of course, I don't have any of those. You put those somewhere in the middle. But this particular collection does have some thematic or stylistic and genre links and connections. So I don't write realism. Realism is short fiction or a novel that recreates a realistic situation that you could find in the real world. It's the most popular form. Traditional realism is nothing in it is going to raise an eyebrow. Like all of it is plausible and possible. Relationship stories, things like this. My fiction, and the fiction I'm really drawn to, is unrealistic in some way. And there's all these terms for them. There are magical realist stories, there's surrealism, there's absurdist stories, science fiction, fantasy, fairy tale. These are all genres of fiction that are not realistic. There's always something in them that is impossible in some way, a magical element, a science fiction element that takes you out of the real world, out of the realm of realism and possibility, but is still working in this unreal way to talk about the real world. And that's what I do. So my stories are magical, they're surrealist, they're absurdist, and they're fantastic in that way, fantastical. So I arrange them in this way. I don't write just one type of unreal story, I write many. So there'll be, if in the table of contents, it's arranged by the sort of type of weird story you're gonna get. And it'll say like, experience surreal times. In that section, those 4 stories in that section are going to be surrealist stories that work on a surreal moment and use the tropes of surrealism. There's another that'll say like witness magical things, and in that there's always a sort of like phenomenon, a magical moment in the story, or a magical thing around which the whole thing operates. So that was how I tried to arrange it, and I started to see that, oh, I've got these like 4 different modes that I write in, and oh my God, like I actually have like the same amount of stories in each of these modes. I could collect them and divide the collection that way, and that was super fun. And people respond to that in reviews, like it gets like mentioned that there's this like fun way of arranging the whole collection around the type of magical or unreal or surrealist things that are happening.
Yeah, I noticed that one of the things that besides the surrealism and absurdism, well, I want to get into that a little bit more, but one of the things I loved about your writing was sort of this wonderful humor that also comes in these pieces along with this. And I mentioned that because working in academia, one of the stories that particularly struck me was Our New Community, which is a story that tickled me because of sort of its nth degree of taking things to the nth degree. And of course, it's about creating these new courses or going to great lengths. And I love the titles that you came up with, like walking aimlessly in known locations, staring at walls and thinking while seated. Another one was looking in the mirror while depressed. This sort of a twist the humor, and then particularly appropriate, I thought, for readers of fiction, novel reading without paying attention.
Yep.
So I was wondering if you could talk about, you talked about, you do a lot of surrealist or absurdist reading, but that balance between these sort of the serious themes that come out amidst all this absurdity, and the sort of empty stuff, and then the tongue in cheek, and then all of this sort of combined, and then getting to a serious point that someone can take something from the story. Now, if you talk about that sort of balance that you have with the humor.
Sure. I'm so glad that you found it funny. I love humor in writing. I mean, one of the forms I love most, or like the genres I love most, is absurdism, which basically takes like this like bizarre premise that on its face is sort of laughable and gets into like absurd situations that are comic, but they also seem to be like saying something. It's not straight comedy. It's not like a SNL sketch, but like it looks like that in places, but is getting at something. It's like dark satires or something. Just absurdities. So that story, Our New Community School, is it is talking about something serious. It's talking about like the ways in which we either use or don't use our education, and the ways that we occupy ourselves, and the things that we actually need to learn. If we were to think about our pursuit in life as the things that we actually do, not what we studied for, what are we doing? Like we're sitting and staring at walls while thinking. So like, did we get prepared for that through school? Wandering aimlessly in the park. Like I spend time doing that. Did I learn how to do it properly? Is there anything to gain from it? So the classes at the New Community School are just like layering in the things that I think like, oh, if we could get more and more practical, like, yeah, we could take a cooking class. Those things exist. Oh, we could take, some sort of like instrument repair at the school is like really useful. But if you continued down the line of like, what is practical and useful in our daily lives to study instead of like higher intellect or art, what would we get to? We would get to like, I don't know, when you're staring in the mirror and you're not feeling that well, you can do that better or worse if you have an education around it. So I really like that, because I think that the world is like constantly always sad and funny, depending on perspective. And you can laugh or you can cry. I also think that the world is made up of unreal things. I know that people say like, why do you write unrealistic things? Don't you want to write about the real world? But I mean, like I live in my head a lot. I have other people's like I have like an imagination, and I don't think about reality 100% of the time. Like I'm living in the future. I'm imagining bizarre things. We have dreams. So I think my writing is trying to reflect the ways in which I actually operate in the world, or feel like the world comes together. And it's funny. I think about things seriously, but I'm also I can not take myself that seriously, and I like to laugh. And then also like there is this mix of, there's serious things in the world and there's realistic things that you got to deal with, but also like there's a little bit of magic around, or magical thinking throughout our daily lives. So all of that hopefully comes together to like make you laugh, make you think, take you out of the real world, and make you think about the real world. And that's what I love in other people's writing, and that's what I try to do in mine.
I think you really hit home on that one. And I particularly enjoyed some of the ways you take sort of common tropes in many fairy tales, like in The Genie, where that is a common, everybody knows the story of Aladdin's lamp, and the genie comes out and you can make 3 wishes, and you take that sort of trope, but you completely change it. And, and I kind of enjoyed that story because it put me in an unexpected place, number one. And also it was sort of like, well, what if you really could have 3 wishes and they really were going to come true? What would be the burden
Oh,
of that, to a person to actually be able to control, have that kind of control. So you asked this serious question in this completely fantastical, absurd way, which was great. I love that story. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about that kind of use of tropes that are common, but yet you do something different with them than one would expect.
yeah, I like that. So basically in that first section of the book, it's the meet fabulous strangers, which is a play on the word like fabulism, which is another genre of creating like modern fables. So there's a giant, there's a genie, there's a robot, there's a clone. And these are not things that I invented, like those are available to any writer or creative person to talk about. And people have written countless stories about genies and giants and robots and clones, maybe. So when I'm doing that, like there's a certain thing I like where there's like familiarity for anybody who's engaging with it. So you see the genie, as you said, like you've seen genies before. So you understand the contract and you can sort of subvert expectations when you understand how someone's going to engage with it. So you see a genie, he comes out of the lamp and there's someone there. You're expecting to be granted wishes. And then the fun of it was actually trying to make magical realism. So magical realism is about realism with a magical element. It is not about making a total fantasy. It's about trying to take the magical thing seriously. So if this thing did enter the world, don't make it a cartoon or a comic or a fantasy, make it real. So this genie comes in, and that's the way that you can really sort of play with old tropes, is if you want to sort of move it into a new genre. Aladdin is a fantastic old story. Like that is not meant to be 100% reality. It is a magical romp in many ways. And it is not trying to tell you about like the human condition in some way. It's an entertainment with good characters. And the story that I wrote, the genie, is really actually trying to say like, okay, if this thing happened in your basement in the suburbs of Boston, what is going to happen? Like, what would you do? What would it feel like? How hard would it be? And that's a way just to move it right out of its genre into a new one, moving into from fantasy into magical realism. And now you're experiencing it in a new way. You've got a new perspective on it. I love doing that. The same thing with like the robot. Robots are, a trope of science fiction, and they're supposed to be in some ways like artificially intelligent and going to help us and then maybe dominate us. But in this one, like there's like a robot that forms a relationship with the person, the narrator of the story. And it's like, okay, what would it be like to actually have something that was artificially intelligent and you got that you didn't like it? But like this robot had like a bit of a personality and some like artificial intelligence, and like you didn't get along. Like that would be a real problem. So
See, that already happens, but
yeah.
yeah, I mean, that was a great little story, the complicated and annoying little robot, where sort of like this non-human character, the robot, in some way acts as more like a mensch or more like a person than the person acts in some way, or at least it's not a jerk or whatever. It's acting decently or responsibly, and
I feel for that little robot.
yes, and we're having this empathy with the robot, but it's also I'm wondering how much metaphors in there, because like I was going, oh, is this robot a woman? Is this about a relationship with women, or is there anything like that built into it, or am I reading that in? And I was
You want me to tell you?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, yes, sure, tell me. Because
No, it's not a metaphor for any relationship I was in.
no, I mean, or sort of a view of this person who's always helpful and always doing things, and then they can't take it anymore. I don't know, but but it was also humorous as well. I don't know. I found that really humorous as well. But you have a couple of places where the so-called non-human is acting in the humanity role, like that story about the giant. Can you tell us about that as one of your opening stories? I think that is the first story in your book, is the giant. And the giant isn't hurting anybody, but it's this fantastical, non-realistic person or character, and the giant acts in one way and all the people act in another way.
Yeah.
And
that is another sort of like, just like the genie, the giant has been written about in all these different ways. And there's a certain expectation when it comes along. So
right.
When you see when you see a genie, what, like, a couple things to expect, because it's just part of entertainment and culture that we know. There's, if you see a giant, certain expectations come along as well. And the fun part is like, okay, what would the realist story be with this magical element? So with that story, he doesn't do anything. Like, the giant is just there, and he's sort of tired. He just like leans against the town hall and blocks off traffic on one of like the main streets downtown. And it's like amazing at first, but then people are just like, well, like, I used to work on that block, and I just like literally can't go back to my job. This giant is kind of annoying. This giant is like awful. So like, actually trying to imagine what would it be like to have this magical thing happen and then take it realistically. I think the ways in which I progress that story is the ways in which I predict it would actually work. That there would be unbelievable, phenomenal attention, disbelief, joy, and awe that would eventually become so ho-hum that nobody cared. So like, after like several weeks of just having a giant sit there, you just can't maintain that level of interest. You just got to go on with your life as you're reacting to it. It's a funny premise, but it's also like something I truly believe about humanity, is like, we have this unbelievable capacity for curiosity, interest, and desire that always turns into something normal and mundane. Right. It's wild.
Yeah, it was the fantastical and the extraordinary becoming just humdrum.
Yeah.
And how does that happen, and why does that happen? It was a great story. I think the readers of your book are going to love that one. So I want another fun aspect of your book, and you talked a little bit about this issue of realism and non-realism, but one of the aspects of your book is you mention places situated in around Boston, or I don't, some of them may be exactly real, some of them not. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the idea of place itself as a factor in your writing.
Mm-hmm. I never thought of, there's people who are writers that really can like evoke place, or like focus on place, or place location really matters and is formative for what they're talking about. And I have lived in Boston, and I have lived in Saratoga Springs, New York, where I went to college. I've lived in Tucson, Arizona, where I went to grad school. I lived a little bit in Paris and Buenos Aires. And whenever I'm writing a story, I feel like this is true for other writers that I've talked to too, is like, if I'm writing a story and like place doesn't particularly matter, I've just got to set it somewhere. I have certain go-to locations. Like, if I'm in a kitchen, like it's the kitchen at my mother's house. The character's in a kitchen, it's like the first thing that's there. If then the kitchen matters and it has to actually work in the story in a particular way, then the kitchen starts to morph. But a lot of times my ideas are not place-based, but they've got to happen somewhere. Like, you've got it, like, there's got to be places that they go. So in a story like Unidentified Living Object, which is the clone story, like largely what I'm thinking about is Cambridge and Somerville. So but it's also mixed with like the apartment that I had in Tucson. So like the main character lives at the apartment that I had in Tucson, but when they go out and they go into the gallery, that's in Somerville. When they're going to the Dunkin' Donuts shop, that's the one at the Somerville Cambridge line. When the character in the story Gracie is walking around looking for this lost dog, that's Somerville, Hampshire Street, Inman Square, going down into Harvard Square, and those all get mentioned in specific. And I was picturing that. I used to live in Inman Square in Cambridge, and I can picture the five corners and the basketball court and the bar that is mentioned there, and then like the underpass going into Harvard and like the line down to Somerville. So if I can actually, if someone is moving around in space, there are a couple of places where I feel really comfortable imagining. I can like sort of see the geography as I'm writing it. And definitely like Somerville and Cambridge are places I go back to all the time for my characters. But it's never like, oh, I'm going to write a Somerville in Cambridge story. Oh, this is going to be a story about Boston. It just so happens that like once they start moving around, I start to immediately picture those streets until, and if it's okay for it to stay there, it'll just stay there. If it needs to change because something's happening in the story and it can't be placed in Cambridge, it'll start to change. But that's my blueprint, is those places where I've lived.
Oh, that's really great. One of the things that also, if we could talk about, we've talked a little bit about the characters, the genie and the robot and, like that. One of the aspects that I liked about your writing was what I call a pithy detail. You say a lot of detail and get across a lot of detail or imagery to the reader in a very, very succinct way. And I really love that. And I was wondering if you could talk about sort of this macro lens of detail in certain places in your writing, and then other places it's just, it's kind of going along. You don't have that kind of detail. And is this something that you really think about, in a particular way, or why you add those kind of elements in? It's sort of like in the midst of all this absurdity and unrealism and fantasy is just striking realistic detail.
Yeah. There's like technical reasons for it. There's like reasons of like resonance. I love a good detail in a story or a novel. Like a good description is something I will marvel at each and every time. Someone describes something in a way that I've never heard before, but it's perfect. Wonderful. That is a joy of reading, is having someone say something that just perfectly captures it. And I don't think of myself as like someone who's gifted with metaphor. There are some people who can write something and just the analogies that they make are perfect. And I wish I had that skill. What I do have is a few tricks up my sleeve for how to get details into stories. And it's not, you don't select at random. You don't want to focus on things that don't matter. You don't want to bring out a detail that's going to be distracting. Also, you can't have the whole thing be like hyper detailed, because then you're going to bog down the reader. It's not going to move. So what I try to do is like, I'll identify like where I need the reader to slow down. I need them to notice something that is happening. I need them to actually read this slower or feel it more. And then there are certain parts where they can read faster because they're getting certain useful information, but I don't need them to actually focus in just yet. So one thing that I do is that in particular moments of importance, where I want the reader to actually be right there with the character and notice something going on, slow down, that's when I layer in details, but it's a specific type of detail. We live our lives with five senses. If we have our five senses, if we have all of them, we are experiencing the world in all of our senses that are available to us, but we don't actually notice. There's sometimes where like sight is going to be most important, or if like you're eating, like smell and taste. I can right now feel what this chair is like under my butt, but like I also have no need to think about that while like doing whatever I'm doing in class. It's not always aware, but when something important happens, we get information from all of our senses. So in a story, there's a lot of visual detail, maybe there's like sound. And then if something important happens, I layer in all of the other senses in detail, so that to slow someone down and make them feel embodied. If you've ever read a novel and there's been a particular scene where you really felt like you were there and you can remember it and like you were in it, those are moments where I pretty much guarantee if you went back and looked and studied the scene, you would see all the senses being described, because it's actually pulling you in and making you understand, like, oh, this is a real moment. So that there's a smell to the fire in the room, or the smoke. There's like a taste of coffee. You can see whatever's being described. You can hear the like clicking radiator, or like the hum of the refrigerator. Those types of things, if you just mention and just start ticking off the things that are happening to all the senses to the characters, the reader then is in there. They can actually hear, smell, taste, feel, all of that stuff, and all of a sudden they're like, whoa, I'm in the room with them. So those are the moments when it's an important moment. I'll layer in all of the details and try to come up with ones that are not that obvious. Like the clicking radiator is not a remarkable detail, but it's a real detail, and it's small and people can hear it. But it's not the same as like just saying like the wind blowing, which could be interpreted in all these different ways. Like one precise little detail that is real but like a little bit unexpected brings someone right into the moment. And
Yeah.
that's when I do it.
I just thought they were remarkably effective, and enjoyed those a lot. That kind of focus, like just immediate focus. So I enjoyed that. Another thing that I wanted to do, I want to read a little passage, a quote from your story, An Exact Thing.
Okay.
But anyway, part of it said, you wrote, great novels ask questions. Great works of art understand the difference between vague and subtle, puzzlement and mystery, not knowing and the unknown. That's a quote from your story. So this exact thing kind of moves from, I don't know, maybe a good thing to too much, or kind of, I've got to whom can we trust? That question. Well, what questions or mystery are you solving in this, or if at all, with just this short story, even though it's not a novel? But with your short stories, what are some of the questions you're asking?
In an exact thing, or
yeah, An Exact Thing.
Well, that particular line is something that like is, a measuring stick for me when it comes to certain writing. Like there is a difference between mystery and vagueness. Like there is a difference between not knowing and the unknown. I think that the best things that happen, the most mysterious, most alluring things that happen in writing, is when you're not confused at all. You know exactly what's happening, but you don't know why. And I think that there's a tendency to make things like vague or unclear to keep them mysterious, but that's actually paradoxically not mysterious. That's just frustrating. So like, if like in the story, An Exact Thing, it tells you everything that's going on. There is no question about who is there and what they're doing. It's just why. So there's a book, it's a phenomenon, people read it, they love it, they talk about it, they're talking with their friends, and they're getting into fights with their friends about it. This happens.
Yes.
They're getting into fights with their significant others. They're having disagreements about it, but then they also like love this thing. So there's no question, like they're reading the thing and talking about it, but they're getting so worked up about it that there's this mystery. And I think that for that story, it's and what I'm exploring there is just how powerful it is, the things that we like and hold dear, or like the works of art that we treasure. And if someone else doesn't, or doesn't understand it, like the power of that fracture of just, if you have a favorite book and someone reads it and they're just like, I don't get it.
Yeah. Like
lost something.
Yeah.
You've like really lost something in the relationship. Of course, like it's not going to turn out that like people break up because they don't like the same book, which happens in that story. But the idea that we can actually have things so dear to us that they will affect how we relate to somebody else. This happens all the time. Students at Berklee, we're talking about music. Someone says like, oh, I love this. And someone says like, oh, I can't stand that stuff. It's just a song and it's just an opinion, and not everybody's the same, obviously, but like, you wind up feeling a certain way about someone once you learn that. And in that story, I just think that I can't understand how some people don't read a work the way I do. And it's a mystery to me what goes on in their head. We both read the same thing. We both, can talk about it. We both understand what happened, but they don't respond to it the way I do. That's a mystery. What is going on in their head and heart? And I'll probably just like never be able to have that experience that they have.
I thought it was like such a great story, and it kind of speaks to the wonderment of perspective and opinion, and how people get stuck in those viewpoints and don't know why they're and it's so applicable to other things in life besides just a story or a piece of art or a piece of music. And I think that people will get a lot out of well, we don't know if they'll have the same opinion about that, but
Yeah.
I get a lot out of that story. Again, a great short story to encompass something that people may not think about as much in that way. And the story brings it out, something that we recognize but may not have thought of. Another one was one of the things that struck me, and I guess in writing, this is something I don't know too much about, but the opening sentences, when I was in high school and taking literature, they always talked about you had to have the great catch of your opening sentence. And some of your stories have those great catches, those great opening sentences. And one of them I wanted to mention was the Kind Eyes story.
Okay.
And with this sentence, you could steal stuff if you had a car waiting. And that really, okay, where is that going to take us? So I was wondering, how you view as a writer these kind of opening sentences, or do you feel they're as important in a short story? Or is that something that's sort of passé today in literature? I don't know.
The first sentence, not passé. First sentences matter. There's the title, and then there's the first sentence, and that's where we're all gonna start. So you gotta, as you pointed out, like you gotta hook somebody or do something with the opening. Yeah, the first sentence is that particular one that you read. You could steal stuff if you had a car waiting. That story is so. It's a first person story. It's a first person narrator, and that person has a very particular way of talking and looking around. And that one had to be this sort of like, you are immediately just like thrust into this person's perspective in their head. You don't get any, like, you don't have like the setting yet. You don't like know who the hell this is or what they're doing. You're just like immediately like in their mind. And then it starts to fill out after that. But that was very important for that one. Is just like, okay, if you want to get on board with this story, you're going to have to get in this person's psyche. You're going to have to get in this person's perspective. You're going to have to jump in. So if you read that first line, you say like, you could steal stuff if you had a car waiting. You know that there's someone talking.
Yeah.
And then you might be intrigued about like stealing. Okay. That is something that is illegal. So immediately some interest. He's talking to you. Oh, you could steal stuff? Like, who are you talking to? There's a couple questions raised there. I think that the best thing for a story, the first line to do, and then a second and a third all the way through, is to ask a question, answer it, ask a question, answer it the whole way through. A lot of like the sort of like more bizarre premise stories that I have just start with whatever premise it is.
Yeah.
Immediately is going to ask a question like, like the genie is still floating there. Is like, okay, you've got a premise. If you don't want to read a story about a genie, I'm not hiding that. So you can move on to the next one. But if you're like, ooh, a genie, I'm not going to bury the lead. There you go. The genie's still floating there. And now you've got a little picture of it. So I love a good first line, and I will sometimes write them after some. It's great when they're like the first things that you write and you feel like you've got the voice down and everything. But a lot of times it's revision after revision, perspective changes, style changes. And then you realize, oh, this would be right here in paragraph 3 where I say this. That's the first line. Get rid of that first part. Now it's usually like buried somewhere. A first line can be in the middle of your draft. And then you realize that's where, oh, that's a great place to start. It raises so many questions. It's an intriguing line. It's going to make someone think like, what's happening? Anything other than just boring the hell out of a reader to start is great.
It did not bore. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about structure, since you have short stories. Structures may be truncated or not as developed, obviously, as novels. But one of the things I thought you tended to focus on, well, we talked about this already a little bit, about objects, small objects, everyday things, the everyday details of life. One of the stories centered around a toilet, just an object that you wouldn't think of at the center of a story. But if you could talk about this idea of a detail or an object or a thing being kind of a part of how you use it as a structural element, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that particular story, Porcelain God, the toilet is the center of the story. And when you have an object, you have the potential for a symbol, and you have the chance to evolve it. So if the toilet at the beginning of the story is not the toilet at the end of the story, the object is the same, but it is now a symbol, and you imbue it with meaning section after section, like character interaction with it after character interaction with the toilet. It then can take on meaning. So if you have something that like repeats, like images can repeat. This happens in song lyrics too. If you've got 3 instances of this object appearing, it better be different each time, or it should be evolving each time, because you have the chance to make symbolism. And what I love about that is like almost everything in creative expression is doing something indirectly. So I have a feeling. I could tell you what it is, or I could create a story that would give you that feeling. So like, and you're trying to do it in an indirect way. Like instead of just saying, I want you to feel sad, I could say that, or I could say, I felt sad when this happened. And I would communicate effectively to you, like what happened to me. But in a story, what you're trying to do is get something communicated in a non-direct way, because we would just have a conversation about it otherwise. So the objects become the vehicle to get that across. So if you start to look at this object, this toilet, and then all of a sudden it's like an annoying thing at the beginning and it's just a toilet, and then later it's like, oh, it's sort of like representative of this parent who died, and then later on, oh, it becomes sort of like a nice thing that they celebrate around, and like they don't see it as ugly or stupid anymore. They see it as sort of like beautiful. You are then saying like, this is the evolution of grief, instead of saying, here's a toilet. So you always have the option in this indirect way to get the reader or whoever's experiencing it to sort of get that indirect communication. And it's so much more satisfying for someone to get it themselves rather than to be told. So if you work with objects in that way, you have the chance, the reader has the chance to like be creative on their end and like get their own stuff out of it instead of being explicitly told what to think.
Yeah, that's really great. We talked a lot about your humor, and I thought one of the stories I particularly liked on the humor end was A Proper Hunger. And this story, you kind of poke fun at foodie trends, where again, taking it to absurdist heights, possibly, you could say that. And it goes on and on, how further from reality it keeps moving. And you talked a little bit about how you use different kinds of forms of fabulist or non-realism. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what draws you to that genre.
Yeah. Who knows why we like the things that we like?
I don't. Yeah.
I guess it's I mean, I also really like realism. I like traditional realism too, and I read a lot of it. And I like short stories that don't do non-realistic things. But I can remember a moment in college where I was an English major, creative writing major, and there was a lot of, I mean, we were reading like a lot of realism, and I'd really wanted to do something like that. And then I read a story by George Saunders, and then I read a story by Stephen Millhauser, and they were not doing realistic things. And the ways in which they were doing it was just as powerful as like the realism. And in some ways, like I was like sort of blown away about, oh, what are the other possibilities? You enter into this realistic story, you know that you're going to stay in this realistic story and you might find out something about the characters or life. Great. But when I opened up the Stephen Millhauser story and there was a magic carpet at the beginning, but it was like literary fiction, it's like, I don't know what this is going to be doing. And it just seemed like I couldn't read these things fast enough and I couldn't get into them enough because like I was just dying to know, like, what are you doing with this stuff? Like, how are you able to use magical things or unrealistic things that actually resonate with me as a human being? I thought that this was just all supposed to be fantasy and entertainment stuff for kids, but then they were using it in a particular way that was actually informative about humanity or like our conditions. Like, and for me, there's just such incredible metaphorical value to it. When you read a realistic story and two people have a relationship that crumbles, you can think about the ways in which it either relates or doesn't relate to your own relationships that have crumbled or whatever. But when you have an unrealistic story, that unrealistic element becomes so open to whoever's looking at it that it's not a one-to-one. It's not, you can invent for yourself whatever metaphorical meaning it has in your life. So that giant is whatever the giant is in your life. The thing that was so powerful and now is mundane, or so like awe-inspiring and now is boring. Like that's your own. You can think of your own. It's not actually showing you that, oh, I was really obsessed with this. I was really obsessed with this video game, and now I don't play it anymore. If I did that, it would be a realistic story about losing interest in something, and you could maybe say like, oh yeah, like I used to like this thing too. But the giant allows you just like, what is the giant in my life? I love that. So it seemed like there was always, even though they're not doing something realistic, it was always so much more possible in the unrealistic stories to think about my own life or like put into it my own stuff. And I want to give readers that opportunity all the time.
Yeah, I think your book really is, it's a thin book, folks, but it really packs a powerful punch in terms of all these themes that touch on the human condition and, all these powerful metaphors, and yet in very, very easy to read and fun way and funny in pointing out our foibles.
My writing style is not dense. It is readable.
Very, very readable. Is there anything else you'd like to mention about your book to our audience?
The cover of it, do you have it there in front of you?
I do have it, but I don't know if this blurry thing will allow me to do it, but if you can see.
Oh yeah, but yeah, so the cover of that is so it's a tarot deck by this artist duo called Khan and Selesnik, and they're wonderful visual artists. And I saw a show of theirs at the MFA. They do these, primarily what they do is that they make these like fantastical or magical moments. They take actors, they take people, they dress them up in certain different ways. They put them in settings and like change around the settings to make it like look like it would be not of this real world. And then they take photographs. So they're photographers, but the things that they set up are unrealistic situations. I'm really drawn to that. I think that's great. That is a tarot deck that they made. So those are drawings of all of these little characters that would appear in a tarot deck, but they're so intricate and beautiful, and they just seem to be little creatures. And as soon as I looked at that, each one of those little things, I saw a potential character or story or like something magical happening to each one of those little characters. So even if you don't read the book, you should buy it for the cover so that you can see all of those little magical little creatures from that tarot deck that is so beautiful. I just love the cover of the book.
Well, I think that people will enjoy reading the book as well.
Oh, thanks.
I know I did. So I really appreciate talking to us about your book today and coming to Books at Berklee and being part of this series. I really appreciate that, and learning more about your writing. And people will enjoy the okay end of Funnytown.
Excellent. This
Yeah.
was so great, Judy. Thank you so much for these great questions. I love talking to you about it.
Oh, yeah, it was really a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.